This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. That's right, you're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast produced by Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This week it gives me very great pleasure to introduce my guest Collin Bjork, who is only slightly putting me on the spot because you actually teach podcasting as your day job. So this is mildly terrifying. But this is a show about great trash and problematic faves, and you pitched Texas, which is fascinating. So, I mean, I guess the first place to start might be you are a Texan.
I am.
So you're in a very good position to call Texas a problematic fave, I suppose. You sent me a few different links in the lead up to this conversation about sort of music and food and a little bit of history and things. And one of the things that struck me is that the kind of the great American founding myth, and myth in the anthropological sense. So myth doesn't necessarily mean something that's not true. It means like a story that has a particular cultural position. Is of America as the place where all of these different traditions come together. You know, the melting pot. And all of the stuff in the articles you sent me that seems good about Texas is kind of like Texas being the most American bit of America in that sense. Like all of the good bits are, here is this incredible melange of unlikely stuff coming together and making something neat.
Yeah. To the extent that American exceptionalism is this overblown idea that America is the best at everything, Texas exceptionalism is perhaps even greater than that. Where we're the biggest and the best of the states is the kind of the mantra, the myth, right? The narrative that gets told and retold again. And part of it is that coming together of cultures, which in the mythic retelling of that can be quite romantic and downplay some of the complications that come together bringing together those cultures. But there are some really great things that emerge from that combination of cultures.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, you talk about the romance of it. My dad is from Dundee, so he is very Scottish. But he became just enchanted with, there was a movie that he watched, I can't remember what it was now. I think it was some mystery thing. But anyway, it had this sort of Tex-Mex soundtrack, which had been put together by someone like T-Bone Burnett, you know, one of these people who puts together astounding collections of music for movies. And he just became kind of obsessed for a little bit with Tex-Mex music. As, you know, this guy from Dundee whose background is very much in the kind of like folk bleeding into psychedelia thing that happened in the UK in the 70s, and then, you know, all the other stuff that hit the UK like ska. But something about the kind of the mythic combination there is very very attractive and very intoxicating.
Definitely. It's interesting to I think the myth idea is a really good way of framing it because it highlights the faves, the good aspects of what you're talking about in this podcast, the things that we really love about a piece of culture, in this case, a country that is, or a state that is representative of a culture and thinks of itself as a country, but also that the myths sometimes obscure the other stuff. So I think that maybe one way of talking about this before we dive into the music element is the history of Texas. Just briefly, is kind of has this problematic faves or reserved recommendations way of thinking about it, because Texans are quite proud of the fact that they're the only state in the Union that was its own nation prior to joining the United States of America, right? This sets us apart. Of course, it also overlooks Hawaii, which was its own kingdom and indigenous set up prior to U.S. colonization. But anyways, Texans are very proud of this, right? We say, oh, we were our own country for 10 years in the 1830s and 40s, and that makes us independent and more better than everything, right? This, I'm exaggerating a bit, but this is the narrative that gets told and retold in schools and places like that. And the bit that gets left out a lot of times, frankly, that I didn't know until embarrassingly too late, later in my life, was that one of the key reasons Texas separated from Mexico and became its own country for, was it 9 or 10-ish years prior to joining the United States, was because when Mexico won its independence from Spain, Mexico said, we're outlawing slavery. And Texans said, to hell with that. We're making too much money off of enslaving black people, and so we're gonna try to separate from Mexico and form our own nation state that says slavery is okay. So there's this way in which the independence of Texas as a nation gets celebrated, but also it's highly problematic. This is where that tension is.
And, I mean, that's again one of the ways in which it's kind of a perfect microcosm for America, because if you start digging into American history with a critical eye, you discover that a lot of things that are difficult about the way that America is now result from this situation which derives from, we've built our economy on slavery, which is incredibly profitable, but also means that we need to be very armed and paranoid because we've made an underclass of people who can only ever improve their lives by killing us and taking our stuff. Like there's no peaceful social progression out of slavery. It has to be a fight by definition. And that dynamic has kind of informed all of this stuff going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely right. And I think that's why you see a lot of there's a lot of talk about the insistence of freedoms. Right? We're defending our freedoms in the United States, but especially so in Texas. Which is quite different than here, right? Here, this is a historian who wrote this book called Freedom and Fairness. It's sort of saying, this sort of compares the United States and New Zealand and says, these are two kind of open, liberal, capitalist, post-capitalist democracies, but they actually have quite different kind of cultures and ethoses, if you will. How did that come to be? And so he writes this book, and I've only read the introduction, so I'm not going to cite any more than that, but where he says one thing that he sees is that for this idea of freedom is crucially important to Americans, whereas this idea to fairness is essential to New Zealanders. And he's talking across political lines, conservative and liberal. And I'm digressing a bit, but I think that for me is emblematic of what we see in Texas, but amped up. Like part of my freedom is the ability to carry a gun with me anywhere. And recently Texas, this is one of the problematic bits, Texas passed last year a gun law where you can carry a handgun without a permit, without taking a class. You could always carry a rifle anywhere you wanted. Without a permit, but now the gun laws get looser and looser, which is dangerous.
Yeah, and I mean, the gun thing is very contentious all through the states, and in fact, I, for various reasons, know people who are very wound up about the gun law changes that New Zealand made in the wake of the massacres in Christchurch. Less contentiously, that's also kind of the philosophical underpinning of like Texas having this weird idiosyncratic power grid, which is unlike anywhere else in the States and which fails catastrophically when the weather gets cold.
Yes.
Which it does, it turns out. And that's because, again, of that, like, there have been changes made for kind of ideological reasons to do with like maximizing liberty and choice. Yeah.
That's it. The power grid thing in Texas, the cold snap was it just last year? Was it 2 years ago?
I think it was last year.
I think it was just last year in February. All the kind of the increasing number of disasters kind of start to blur together and seem so frequent in my head. But that one, Texas decided, no, we want our own independent grid. We don't want to, a lot of the other states in the U.S. share their power so that when a disaster happens or when other situations occur, they can share their power across state boundaries. But of course, Texas said, no, we're the independent, we're the former nation state. We do our own thing here. It's our freedom, by golly, to do it our own way. And then it failed. Yeah, and it's and people died, and it was so bitter cold, and the power was off for so long. It's hard to wrap your head around the ways that that insistence on freedom, my way, my doing it, when you take it to an extreme, you get extreme consequences sometimes, I guess.
And look, I mean, lest it be thought that I am a New Zealander throwing rocks at America, which is a thing that we sometimes like to do in New Zealand.
I'm an American who likes to throw rocks at America sometimes.
But I mean, New Zealand has something that is going to become, if not handled somehow, an unworkable situation with power. It just keeps getting more and more expensive. And part of the reason for that is that New Zealand has what used to be a nationalized power system that was then like privatized, but privatized in a very strange way where it still actually functions collectively because that's how the infrastructure was built. But we have this sort of fiction of competing capitalism, and it doesn't work very well. And so, every time people try and make these kind of ideological changes to things that have a sort of natural way of functioning, like it just is easier to run a power grid as one big thing until you run out of places that you can easily connect to. You run into these weird problems that can then cause serious problems. Yeah. So Texas is, I guess, the story of that frozen. They called it. What did they call it? I've forgotten the name of what they called it. They had a sort of kind of an Armageddon-y type name. But the takeaway is like when you apply when you map those ideologies onto real life things, and then you amp it up to 11, that can unfold in difficult ways. So that's the thing is I think maybe what's partially problematic about Texas is that, as you said at the beginning, it's sort of like the Americanness amped up to 11, and which when you go there as a tourist, it's pretty darn fun to see people walking around in cowboy boots and to see, to eat just all the big old barbecue and to see like the ways that you imagine the states. The stores are huge, the utes are massive, right? It's everything turned up to 11, and that can be entertaining for a tourist, but if you live there, it has perhaps other consequences. The cars is a really massive thing because that is one of the kind of American vicious cycles is that there are lots of places where it's impossible to live without a car, and the cars are killing us in every possible way they could. And making them taller makes them kill more people faster. We've done an awful lot of bagging, and I think to turn it around a little, we started kind of talking a little bit about the music and the food and those kinds of things. And I think the concept of the most American America kind of holds there as well in positive ways, and maybe this is at the risk of me being didactic on a small New Zealand podcast and telling America how to fix itself, but like there is the seed of a better thing there, I guess is what I'm saying. Like everything that is good is the result of all of these different cultures and influences which have had conflict with one another, but combining in positive and interesting ways.
Absolutely, yeah. The music, I think, is a great example. So we kind of left your father's interest in the Tejano music, the Tex-Mex music, which they call Tejano, the music scene in Texas is terrific across so many different genres. Obviously, you think of Texas, you think of country music, but Texas likes to, again, define itself differently by its outlaw country, which is quite different than Nashville country. Nashville country tends to be its sort of country meets pop music. Outlaw country is the likes of Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, and those people said, no, we want a different sound. We want an independent sound, a little bit rough around the edges.
A modern example might be Steve Earle as well. Because I think he's Texan. I vaguely remember him talking about being a kid in Texas. I might be off base there, but my memory of Steve Earle is that he's also Texan.
Yeah. I'm not 100% certain, but I'll buy it. So Texas. So you got your country music. You've got your Tejano music. So Tejano is a bit of music that I don't know the full history of, but it does come from this merging of cultures, Mexico and Texas, right on that border. A lot of it's sung in Spanish, but it has influences from like the early German cultures there with the accordions and things. And actually, our dog is named after a Tejana singer. Our dog's name is Selena. Everyone says, oh, you named your dog after Selena Gomez. I say, not quite. Although she was good in that podcasting TV series. What was that? Only Murders in the Building. It was a spoof of true crime podcasting. It's hilarious. So anyway, we didn't name our dog after Selena Gomez. We named her after Selena Quintanilla, who is a Tejana singer, who was very, very popular in the 90s until she was shot and killed.
Yes. There's a TV movie, I think, about her.
It was J-Lo's first movie a long time ago, was the old one. There might be a new one too, more recently, I think.
Yeah. But yes, I am vaguely familiar with that story.
Yes.
Because they were like a family band. That was how she started.
Yes,
all of her brothers were her backing band.
Yep. She started as a family band. It was clear that her voice was going to take her somewhere else. She ended up becoming an independent kind of star, really, or independent. She was on her own. I don't know if she was actually with an independent label, probably not. But and then very tragically, her manager, promoter, someone very high up who had been with her a long time, shot her out of there was some kind of conflict there that I don't fully know the ins and outs of. But there was state mourning when that happened, you know? I mean, my partner is from far west Texas where that Tejano music is quite popular, and she said she'll say, and I don't know what she means specifically by this, but that like her school was in mourning that whole week just because she was a loss. She was very iconic of that kind of music, but also just of what it means to be a Texas musician. So yeah,
and also I guess the other element of Texas music is, and this is where you'll probably have more understanding than I do, but my understanding is that there's also a very specific Austin, Texas thing.
Yes.
That's where people like J.J. Cale come from, and J.J. Cale, you kind of almost couldn't really call him country because he's such a very specific, strange thing that he does, and there was kind of this "Keep Austin Weird" slogan that existed for a while.
Yes, there is. The "Keep Austin Weird" is a very popular slogan. It's a slogan that's so Austin is famous for being sort of the liberal and funky and hippie center in an otherwise conservative and very kind of like cowboyish, you might think of. State, and so it's got this funky kind of ethos to it, which you see in its music. You get funky storytellers. You also see it in its it's a very eclectic place and a cool place, which makes it fun. And so yes, it has developed its own sound. Its blues sound in Austin is a real popular one. Obviously, the big name there is Stevie Ray Vaughan is from Austin. There's a big kind of sort of like storyteller, singer, songwriter element, really good storytellers that come out of that kind of Austin scene. Robert Earl Keen comes from nearby. He's a good, storyteller. So yeah, it does. Austin has its own kind of vibe to it, definitely, both in its music and in other elements. Actually, maybe if I can diverge but connect back to something earlier. We talked briefly about the guns. Earlier, there's a great, very Austin weird kind of response to the proposed gun laws. Was this, I don't know, 5 years ago or so? So They were trying to change the laws so that you could bring guns onto university campuses. If it was a public institution, so like the University of Texas, where I was an undergraduate, was a public institution. It's only actually partially funded by the government, very little, 8 or 9%, not much, but it's enough to call it public. So they wanted to say you're allowed to take guns into any public place, publicly funded place, including the university. And of course, university professors and students were like, we really don't want guns in our classrooms, thanks. Or to have a conversation about grades with someone who has a gun. And so there was this protest. The students protested the proposed gun laws, which ended up getting passed anyways, but the protest was called Cocks Not Glocks because it was illegal to have a dildo on a university campus, but they were proposing that it would be legal to have a gun. And so they protested by carrying all of these sex toys onto all of the classes. It's a very iconic, weird, keep Austin weird response to a very serious gun law.
Yeah, and I guess that is kind of an aspect of the kind of like almost its own countryness of Texas, is that you know, if you think about like a province of New Zealand, it would be hard to say that it's quite that diverse and strange, but a province is a lot smaller. It's it's a tiny portion of a state, and I think one of the things that I had a hard time wrapping my head around is that a lot of America is kind of a collection of countries jammed together, and Texas even more so. Yeah.
It's Texas is big. It's massive. It's hard to convey how big it is. It's the size of France. If it was its own economy, it would be this is probably 2 or 3 years old data. It would be the 11th. If it was its own nation, it would be the 11th largest economy in the world. It's massive. A lot of that's oil. So it is big in lots of different ways. And being big in size and population and economy, it's also diverse in those lots of different ways. It's a funny place, Texas. I recommend it for a visit. I really do. I think it's a really fascinating place to visit. I think Austin is the best. There used to be a direct, I'm biased, I'm from Austin, but there used to be a direct flight from Auckland to Houston. I think they're bringing that back later this year. Houston's all right. Houston has really great museums, really terrific museums, but it's a massive city. It's the 4th largest city in the States. It's really overwhelming. And like you said earlier, the transportation, Texas was not built for public transportation, and deliberately, I think. So public transportation is a bit shoddy. You do need typically a car to get around, which contributes to the killing us in a variety of ways. Both like traffic accidents are so common there. I remember coming here and it being like headline news that there was a traffic accident, whereas in Texas it doesn't even quite make it. And then of course the climate change stuff. But yeah, I do recommend a visit to Texas. Whether you want to live there or not, I don't know, but a visit certainly.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of interesting things we can talk about there, and we will do that right after the break because we are around about the halfway mark. So we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irarangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. We talk about great trash and problematic faves, and today I'm talking to Collin Bjork, who actually teaches podcasting and will thus be telling me all of the things I did wrong at the end once we've turned the mics off. Also, a minor note. I usually put these notes at the start, but it's just occurring to me because it's in my other ear. You may hear a small amount of chanting in the background. This is for your spiritual improvement. It will help you have a better next life. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you've also heard my dogs doing their nut at the concept of me talking to someone they can't see. So you'll cope. However, before the break, we'd just been talking a bit about I guess the recommendation that you visit Texas, and I wanted to talk a bit about food because the the kind of theme that I kept coming back to is that the core of good thing there, which you can also kind of apply to America more broadly, is the merging of traditions and people finding ways to take disparate elements and make them work together. And I think that's one of the things that in the articles I read came out again and again about the food as well, is that, you've got barbecue, which comes from this sort of plantation tradition of feeding a huge number of people all at once, and has kind of evolved into this very specific Texan cuisine. You've got Tex-Mex, which again is this kind of collision of Mexican and European American and German influences. I think the German is a bit kind of undersold in terms of how much of an impact they've had there. And all of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The food is terrific, and I think you're right. You're spot on to identify all that kind of coming together of traditions. The German does get overlooked. I am part German in my heritage, so I like to highlight that. My grandma was full German. Bratwurst are so popular, and Central Texas is where the Germans moved to in the early to mid. Primarily in the early to mid 19th century, and so there's quite a big influence around Austin with sausage making and schnitzels and those kinds of things. The barbecue tradition, that's of course one thing people think about with Texas quite a bit, is terrific, right? So it has that, part of it comes from black culture and, as you say, on plantations and part of it comes from kind of cowboy culture, ranch culture, right? So a lot of the cuts of barbecue that are famous are actually the lesser cuts of the cow, right? So when you get a barbecued brisket, it is not a good piece of meat to fry up like a steak and eat it after being cooked for only 10 minutes. It's super tough. And so what happened, I guess, in that kind of tradition is that the cowboys who would drive the cattle north to Kansas City and put it on trains and ship it to the east so that the Easterners could have their filet mignon, they would get the cheap parts of the cow for themselves to eat, and it would be the brisket. So, and other similar cuts. The what's the one that's used for fajitas in Tex-Mex cuisine? It's the skirt steak. So again, really tough. So these things you have to cook. With the skirt steak for Tex-Mex, you have to marinate it for a day or two in advance. For the brisket, you cook it for hours. And
I mean, a brief bit of food science. One of the things you're doing when you're marinating something is you are pre-cooking it.
Yes.
Because putting acid onto meat has the same effect as putting heat onto it, but slower. And so, again, it's a way of like pre-cooking things for a long time.
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, in the case of barbecue, you're talking about people who have to essentially slow cook something, but without access to a kitchen as well.
Exactly.
We're going to have to do this outdoors.
Outdoors with a wood fire, so that's why the smoke became really famous for Texas barbecue. So you're not just cooking a brisket for a long time, you're actually smoking it, and the flavor of the brisket comes from the flavor of the meat that you just smoked. Another fusion of cultures that's interesting is the French influence, actually, which gets overlooked a bit too. So France, Texas.
That's more kind of famously associated with places like Louisiana.
Yes, yeah. Louisiana, which is neighboring to Texas, and New Orleans, of course, French culture, Creole culture, Cajun, that kind of food seeps into East Texas quite a bit. There's definitely that influence there. Texas was actually was at one point owned by France, and when Napoleon needed more money for his wars in Europe, he sold it to Thomas Jefferson, and Texas was part of that big sale of land that France had. So we have a bit of that influence. It comes through with gumbo. So we made, just this past weekend, I did, I think, a very Texas thing. I made smoked turkey gumbo. So we found here, Steve's Whole Foods is closing, and so we found a turkey for 30% off and said...
Yeah, I mean, look, a brief moment to mark a historic tragedy of Palmerston North.
Yes.
No one who is listening to this from outside Palmy will have the faintest idea what we're talking about, but Steve's Whole Foods will be, and Steve himself, who died a couple of years back, will be sadly missed by people who like to eat things in this town.
Yes, absolutely. They were one of the first people we met when we moved here and appreciated Steve and Judy. So honoring them, we went in, bought a turkey at a really good price, and so I smoked it. I smoked it with manuka this weekend. So you cook it over the fire at a low temperature, and the turkey takes on some of the flavors of the manuka. And really, that's all it was seasoned with was the smoke and some salt. And then so we ate the turkey one night, and then we made stock from the turkey carcass and used that stock to make a gumbo, and we put some of the brown meat from the turkey into the gumbo. And that gumbo is a dish. This base, you start with a roux base, which comes from French culture and that kind of thing. So there's so many different mixes of food to really celebrate in Texas.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a point a little bit to the side of Texas, but it's a thing that I find very interesting, which is that a lot of the foods that become kind of iconic are things that start as poverty food. Mm-hmm. So, as we've said with my dad, my background's partly Scottish. Haggis is what happens when you get all of the bits that the Lord doesn't want and you have to do something with it. And it sounds unappetizing. It's actually very good, but it's also iconic of Scottish cuisine. Similarly, we're talking about the barbecue, which is a way of cooking less desirable bits of meat to make them palatable. And similarly, the gumbo is sort of it's halfway between an everything soup and an everything stew, which is very much like, what do we have at hand that we can put in this pot and eat? And we're going to find a way to tie all of these things together, even if they don't necessarily obviously fit.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So many dishes were made like that. The funny thing is, now that kind of Texas style barbecue has become so popular in the U.S. and abroad, that those cuts of meat are more and more expensive. So trying to get a brisket here, it used to be the poverty food meat. Right now, it's quite expensive. The popularity is driving that game. Although I will say you can still get really cheap tacos in some place in Texas, and that's amazing. Like honestly, sometimes some of the best tacos in the state come from gas stations. Like if someone's got a little food truck set up next to a gas station and it's only Spanish speaking, and it smells good as soon as you walk up, like that's a great taco place right there. And if it's affordable, because a lot of times those can be. Yeah, they can be nice, cheap tacos. Oh, I love gas station tacos.
I know. I mean, the concept of like gas station food being good is it's kind of astounding. But work on it. It's interesting because similarly, that is a way of judging ethnic cuisine here. Is that you go into the restaurant, you go into an ethnic food place of some sort, and you notice that you're one of a few pale faces. Mm-hmm. That's probably quite a good sign. Mm-hmm. Similarly, you're not hearing as much English with people running around and doing things, and with the crowd eating the food. That's a pretty good sign.
Yeah. The other thing I quite like about those taco spots is something called a breakfast taco. So a breakfast taco is sort of, you get your tortilla. Usually in Texas, flour tortillas have become more common than the corn tortillas, which you see more often in Mexico. But you get a flour tortilla and you put sort of like fried potatoes and scrambled eggs and usually sausage or something and hot sauce on it. And there are so many different kinds of hot sauce in Texas. The red ones and the green ones and the orange ones and the brown ones and the spicy and not spicy. But yeah, so people will eat tacos 3 meals a day for breakfast too. Yeah.
I mean, the hot sauce thing is kind of fascinating as well because it's one of those things where it does derive from an ethnic cuisine, but it's sort of been adopted by the culture writ large, but also because there has to be a toxic way to enjoy everything. There's this weird, like, I can handle more capsaicin than you can kind of like test of manhood way of consuming it, as well as just like food.
Yeah, that's right. That's and that goes back to that like Texas exceptionalism. It's like, I'm more manly or more Texan or more whatever than you because I eat the hotter hot sauce. There are hot sauce eating contests. Part of those are to rate the hot sauces, but some of them are just to show that you can eat the hotter peppers. And there's definitely a pepperhead community in Texas where you try to eat the ghost chili or the whatever chili. Actually, there's short little plug here for a Texan making Texas-style salsas in Palmerston North. Tex As salsa, made by Carrie Highstead. Really good stuff. And her, she gets jalapenos from Northland, so they're actually properly hot. And she gets cilantro from a local so-and-so, and really good salsas here. So that's where I get my salsa.
Oh, excellent. Do you rate the Kaitaia Fire at all? That was a Northland-made Northland chili sauce.
I don't know it.
Used to, now, to be fair, I have not seen it in a while, so they may have gone out of business, or it may have been a Dunedin thing when I was living in Dunedin, that cafes would have a little bottle of it on the table. But it used to be a thing that you would see everywhere, is that cafes would have a little tiny bottle of this Kaitaia Fire chili sauce, and they did like a red one, which was just chilies, and a green one, which had kiwi fruit in it, I think.
Oh, I think I have seen one with kiwi fruit in it. Maybe it was Kaitaia Fire. If not, I'm gonna go Google it later and have a look.
Yeah, I would be interested in a Texan's opinion of it. I was fond of it, but I'm a Kiwi. I don't know what I'm talking about with chilies.
Nah, sure you do. Yeah, it is funny that I struggle to find. So I have a wee garden out back, and I tried. One of my favorite things to grow are tomatoes and chilies, so I can make salsa and hot sauce. But I struggle to find some of the chilies that I know from back there. So. At least some of them I struggle to find in the supermarket. So I'm trying to grow habaneros, which are I associate with Mexico. I don't know if that's actually where it's originally from. I was very lucky in the States. The last place I lived was actually not in Texas. I finished my PhD in Indiana, which is south of Chicago, and Midwest cuisine, which is, let's say, less flavorful, less spicy than Texas cuisine. But I was very fortunate in the small little town we lived in, was this woman who called herself the chili woman. And she had sort of a seed bank of chilies from all over the world. Oh, wow,
cool.
It's incredible. And so people would mail order seeds and things from her all across the States and across I think she was shipping stuff outside the country. But she was at our local farmers market. So you could find chilies from South America and from Mongolia and all kinds of funky places. It was so cool to have. And then, so I'm still trying to build up my own little collection of seeds here so I can grow some of the peppers that I'm familiar with from Texas.
Excellent. That's very cool. Look, we are not at time, but we are getting on. I did want to, I guess, address another thing, which is, there is an impression I have of the way that things stay the way they are. So we kind of politics, but in terms of the mechanism of politics, both in the States, but particularly in Texas, which is that the way it is governed is not necessarily as reflective of how people are as you might think. And I guess I wanted to ask you if that's true, and if you had any thoughts about how that mechanism works.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about that, and I think that's part of what's problematic, right? If this is problematic faves about Texas, is that Texas, like the United States at large, has created a system where the politicians in power can be in the minority, actually, of views or popularity, but still, because of the way boundaries are drawn and voting systems work, that minority of people can actually be a majority in power. So, for example, the majority of Texans, 60%-ish, I think in the last number that I saw, say no, you need to have at least a permit and a training class to carry a gun, to carry a handgun in a background check. Okay, the majority of Texans, the same with the majority of Americans, also support background checks and stronger gun laws. But the people in power in Texas do not. And they're getting a lot of funding typically from the NRA, the National Rifle Association, et cetera. So there's a way in which the views of the larger population of Texas are not reflected by those who are in power. And part of another mechanism of how that works is what we call gerrymandering in the states, which your listeners may be familiar with, but if you aren't, it's sort of where after a group of politicians gets in power, they redraw the voting boundaries, and they redraw them in a more favorable way. So actually, like a town or a city like Palmerston North, Austin, where I'm from, has, at least, they didn't draw like a big circle or a square around Austin and say this is one precinct. Instead, they drew a little sliver of Austin. They drew 6 little slivers and then connected those little slivers further out to big rural countries that are more likely to vote conservative. And so they found ways to divide up these areas and make it so that the population living there, if they were more liberal, might actually be out voted by the way the boundary is drawn by a more rural population. So it's I think your understanding is correct.
Yeah, and I guess I have a sort of a plea for New Zealanders to be more personally sympathetic to individual Americans on that basis, that people are stuck within this machine that's been built over a long period of time to have very specific outcomes, and it's very hard for any individual American to go, this is rubbish, we should be doing this other thing, because the machine has been built to go in a particular direction very fast.
Yes, that's exactly right. The Texans, the everyday Texans who you meet on the street, meet at a cafe, maybe meet if you get to go to someone's ranch, regardless of their political persuasion, will be delightful hosts, and will likely embrace you as a visitor. So yes, absolutely. Don't take it out on us individual Texans. The fact that our political system is a bit of a quagmire.
Excellent. Well, look, there are 2 things I like to do by way of finishing off an episode, and the first is to ask if you have any specific recommendations, and I guess in this case it's artists or works of fiction or movies or things that people could get access to that are kind of emblematic of the Texas vibe in a good way.
Yes, I forgot about this bit. So I'm glad. I remember thinking prior to having to postpone this to COVID, I was like, I had my ideas for this. I recommend. Okay, 2 things. I recommend for a visit, get out of Houston when you can and go to Austin. Like for me, that's if you can only visit one city, that's the city to visit, and schedule time for food and music. In terms of artists, I really like an Austin artist who I really love, in addition to Selena Quintanilla, who is not actually from Austin, but I mentioned her Tejano music earlier. Her popular song is Bitty Bitty Bum Bum. But I recommend a guitar player called Monty Montgomery out of Austin. He's more of a singer-songwriter style. He's gone a little more pop in the recent years, but I really like his old stuff. He's in my view, one of the best guitar players I've heard. He can play an acoustic guitar in a way that makes you think he's got the ability to play electric guitar solos, but does it on an acoustic. I like Monty Montgomery's old stuff. He's a unique voice out of Austin, the Austin music scene. Obviously, Buddy Holly's from Texas, Beyonce's from Texas. There's all kinds of good stuff. But yeah, that's maybe a recommendation I'd recommend. Cool.
I would suggest that people, if they are sufficiently online, there is a Texan doing things. There's a guy called Robert Evans, who is a podcaster who makes just a stupid number of shows. He makes one called Behind the Bastards, which is a look at bad people who have done bad things in history. It's an interesting, there's a thing that a format for shows that I've only discovered listening to podcasts, which is the concept of the reverse interview, where instead of getting a guest on and interviewing them about something, you get a guest on and you tell them things, and their job is to go, what? And he's kind of a pioneer of that particular form. He also did a couple of books which, if you're interested in the way that the world is, are interesting. He did one called The War on Everyone, which is a look at the rise of white supremacy, and he traces it back, particularly online, and he traces it back to, I didn't know about this, a group in the 1970s called The Order, who carried out a huge number of bank robberies, weren't ever caught, and put all of the money that they got doing the bank robberies into building up essentially online infrastructure before anybody else. So in terms of like people who have had fan communities and little cultural communities on the internet, the Nazis or the American Nazis kind of were in at the ground floor and have always been a part of the internet. And it's kind of terrifying. So he's an interesting bloke whose work to catch up on. Cool. Finally, what do you have by way of things to plug? What things are you doing that people could find?
Yes. So I teach podcasting and science communication at Massey University. And actually, you mentioned earlier, nervous to have me on. I felt also nervous just a few days ago because I was interviewing Claire Kincannon from Our Changing World podcast, the science communication one by RNZ. And I felt nervous because I was interviewing her. And so I feel like, we should just lose the nervousness. We're all just doing what we're doing. Anyways, so I teach podcasting at Massey. I teach it face-to-face here in the 102 and online. So if people want to take a podcasting course, it's pretty rad. I operate a podcast as well called Pod Uni, UNI, which is started partially as a podcast for my online podcasting students, so sort of a how-to. If you can also just listen to that podcast, and I'm now getting up a kind of a queue of interviews with other podcasters about their practices. So there's that, which will have more stuff soon, including Claire's interview.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.